So I want to start with just the basic question. You've got a wonderful piece about Uncle Roger. There's 3 works involved in Uncle Roger, right? Party at Woodside, Blue Notebook, and Terminal.
Yes.
And this Pathfinders project is looking specifically at Blue Notebook.
Yes.
But it makes no sense to just talk about that today without contextualizing
No,
it.
yeah.
So will you
That makes
please
sense.
start by, talking about the large project of Uncle Roger, and then how these 3 pieces fit, and then what Blue Notebook means as a separate entity.
Okay, that's a tall order.
Yeah, it'll take a few minutes.
But how far back do you want me to go?
Well, just think in terms of the work itself. So, what was the kind of the impetus to create a work called Uncle Roger, and the way you conceptualized 3 pieces? I know that serial publication, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Just kind of go through that historical piece.
Okay, I was invited on to our common electronic network in 1986 by an old friend of mine, Carl Leffler, who was a video and performance art curator, and he was very closely involved with Canadian artists and Canadian art spaces, and had seen the importance of online communication through working with Bill Bartlett, who was involved with Art Text, and he himself earlier had worked with Willoughby Sharp and Liza Bier and Sharon Grace on the Send Receive project, which was a project that involves sending images back and forth between California and New York City, or between New York City and California, depending on which node you are at. And Carl had the idea of actually starting a art space online that had interactive communication, but in addition to interactive communication, it also would have a menu with interactive artworks, and they switched publishing Artcom magazine into an online publication, and they also had a store where they were going to sell artist software, which in fact they did. It was actually a very visionary project for 1986. And they chose the Well because the Well's values fit their own values. And so Carl, in the spring of 1986, talked me into going on because I had been working at the time on a project called Bad Information that I was computerizing, and he thought I would be a good fit for the project. I had performed in his space before and he knew my work. So that was the catalyst for Uncle Roger. Now, I had been working with artist books that trying to create random access narratives and narratives that were non-sequential since 1976, but I had never done specifically what I wanted, mainly because all I could do was create a one. So okay, this is an example of an earlier, I think this is a 1981 book I created, that you push buttons and the images came around. The problem was, actually it was great work and people liked it, but you could only make one. So I was coming from a little bit the same place Carl was coming from. How can we distribute experimental literature? And in this case, computer-mediated experimental literature. So I went on, I was amazed. I actually took a little talking on his part because I wasn't used to online communications. I had to go out and buy a modem. In those days, it was not that easy to set up with a modem. It was slow. You had to figure out, you had to have communication software. You had to integrate it with your computer. It was relatively inexpensive because you paid by the minute. Relatively expensive, rather, you paid by the minute. But I was amazed when I logged on. There was an entire community there. There were people talking to each other on what we would now call social media network, and I programmed it into a database. Now at that point I went, oh my God, all this work that I've been trying to put together, all these artist books that I've been trying to create a random access work, I can do it on the computer. And there's an audience on early social media. So there were a lot of factors that went into it. Early social media was certainly a very important part of it because it was as if you could go back to, say, Homer's Day and go into the virtual, this is a virtual online community, and tell a story, and you have an audience. So I began writing Uncle Roger in August of 1996. I figured I would create about 100 what we now call lexias, and would write a database to pull them up, and that the reader would negotiate the work by essentially searching keywords, which is not too dissimilar from searching links in a work of hypertext. Searching keywords and following paths throughout the work.
Sorry, Judy, you just said 96, you meant 86?
86, I'm sorry, 86, thank you. It was 86, August of 1986. And so I wrote, it took me about 6 months to write the work. I then, on December 1st, 86, I put the first Lexia out onto the Artcom Electronic Network. Now, this is not too dissimilar from writing a narrative on Twitter. You will see people writing narratives on Twitter nowadays. Mm-hmm. And you yourself did an entire 24-hour microlit work. But at the time it was a fairly new idea, or a new idea. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing. I loved doing it that way. Mm-hmm. I worked essentially in the way, it used to be long ago, the days of Charles Dickens, for instance, a work of literature was written that way. Only I didn't put out an entire chapter, I put out 1 or 2 records or lexias, as they're now called, every day. And pretty quickly I attracted an audience. Now, at that time, I put up the links or keywords with the lexia. And I said to the readers, you can put this into your own database. Because it was a fairly computer literate audience. And I had wondered when I started writing this, well, are people going to interrupt the story? Will they ask me questions in the middle of the story? How will that work? But about the second day I had posted the work, I began posting the work, Howard Rheingold set up a topic about to respond to Uncle Roger. And I think he began, yeah, what can we say about Uncle Roger as he unfolds? And so there was a parallel topic in the conferencing system where the audience could discuss the work and I could respond to them. And they asked questions ranging from what is this about to how do I put this into my database? Or how would this work in the future? And so
it's like a fan site, like for gaming today.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It was very similar to what you will see nowadays, but at the time it was very unusual. And very exciting also. I mean, I had no idea that I was going to attract such a big audience. But a lot of it was very galvanizing on Artcom Electronic Network. We brought in people from, other parts of the well. And they were interested in the story. Somebody told me it was their bedtime story every day. And it was a lot of fun to do. And I also found telling the story that way, only putting out 1 or 2 paragraphs a day, a lot of editing. I did a lot of editing from when I first wrote it. So it was pretty carefully crafted. And at the same time, I appeal to the social media nature of the audience, which I think is one reason Uncle Roger is a little different from other works of electronic literature. I partially conceived of it as what was called a jig in Renaissance England. Was a body piece of short theater that would pull the audience in. And I was writing to the audience, which is another reason Uncle Roger is different. I also was telling a story that was relevant to the audience. The background of Uncle Roger is the chip industry, which was the start of the personal computer industry, a lesser known chapter nowadays, but at that time, if you lived in California the way I did, and you had lived in the Valley, and your audience were partially people who, were from the Valley, or were programmers, or were familiar with the history, they knew what the story was about. I think nowadays I could explain that a little better. Because the story, a basis for the story is chip espionage. You know, the important thing was to create the fastest chip.
Mhm.
It was very core in creating Apple II. Intel created the 8008 chip and then the 8080 chip. And it allowed for microprocessors that were fast enough and sophisticated enough to run a personal computer of this size.
Yep.
And so the story of Uncle Roger essentially revolves around the chip industry in Silicon Valley.
Mhm.
Some the kinds of parties that took place in Silicon Valley at the time, the people who were involved, the places that were involved, the sort of the spirit of the chip industry.
Zeitgeist.
And I also felt that worked very for the audience and was something that was a story that was important to tell. I had been married to a semiconductor engineer, so I was not unfamiliar with the parties or with the industry. And at the same time, I finished up, I had a female narrator, which was somewhat unusual for computer literature at that time, or interactive fiction, which is what computer literature was at that time. I had a female, the narrator was a woman. The work is somewhat loosely across from a Renaissance era theatrical jig and Jane Austen. And I like the work myself. It has a certain clarity. It reaches back to the era, and I concluded it. I felt on the third file, Terminals, I concluded it with a word processing station, where the narrator moves out of in the beginning. Taking the Jane Eyre model, I made her a babysitter for a magnet, ahead of a lot of semiconductor industry companies. He had 4 companies, not unusual in that area. Houses all over the country, 4 companies, a lot of money, people moving in and out, problems with the chips, stealing other people's designs. But in the last file, the narrator moves out on her own into a very female word processing center in the early days, and she describes the computers that they use. The thoughts that go through her head are mingle the feeling of being in this early word processing shop and her own life.
Ask me a question. Were you trying to parallel? The term computer comes from the women who handled the computers during World War II, right, in England. They were
Yes.
called computers, and then women who came to the 50s were called
I
computers.
didn't know that at the time.
Yeah.
Yes, it wasn't a parallel, essentially. It was more a real life, a real life situation for the era.
Yeah.
And I also felt in the first 2 files, the men were very dominant. And I wanted to shift the focus, so I shifted the narrator's setting to the word processing.
And that was Terminal.
That's Terminals, yeah. Although the chip espionage story runs through that.